Okay, good evening. I'd like everybody to get seated. We're going to try to get started in just a minute. So as we're getting started, of course, if you have a cell phone, please make sure it's on silent. We're actually encouraging some students to tweet the lecture, live tweet it, as they say. The hashtag for that is Reconstruction 150. So feel free to do that, but try not to text your friends while we're engaging in this lecture, but make sure your phones are on silent if you can. All right, so welcome to everybody who came tonight. It's so good to have everybody here. I'm Matt Pinsker. I'm the director of the House Divided Project at Dickinson College, and I'm about to introduce our guest speaker, Eric Foner. But before I do, I just wanted to remind everybody why we're here and why this is such a special time for Dickinson and especially for the House Divided Project. It's our 10-year anniversary, and the college has really nurtured us and helped us develop a number of projects. We began as a multimedia kind of online effort to bring the 19th century alive. We built websites, and that was fantastic. And we're very excited by the work our students have done. We've had over 40 student interns, and a lot of people on campus have helped us over the years. We've had over 4 million page views and 600,000 views on our YouTube channel. So that's all exciting, but we've never had a real space on campus before, and as part of our 10-year anniversary, the college has helped us create a gallery on campus, a kind of classroom museum that will enable students of the Civil War period at Dickinson to study in an atmosphere like a museum. And it's really amazing. And what's even more amazing about it is we're using something called augmented reality to take the work that we do and connect it to the digital resources that we built. So the pictures that you see behind me come from one of the text rails in this new gallery at 61 Northwest Street, where all of the images in the gallery are augmented with digital content, video documentaries, website resources, all kinds of materials that can help the learning process. This is through an app called Orasma. Now, what's great about that is you can then take those exhibit panels, these images and the captions and the stories behind them, and you can download them as PDFs, which we're making available to our teachers that we engage across the country through our teacher training programs. And they can recreate the museum experience in their own classrooms. And what that means with Orasma is they can point phones or tablets at these images, and it will recognize them and then kick out the videos and the website resources that we've built. So it's a great way for us to engage a wide variety of partners. And we've always tried to do that, and that's what this 3-day conference is all about for our anniversary. We are working with groups like the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History and the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, both of which are co-sponsoring this. Part of our work together is with teacher training. On Saturday, we're having a teacher training event. And tomorrow, we're having a conversation with Jeffrey Rosen, the CEO of the National Constitution Center. He's here talking about the second founding, the Reconstruction era amendments to the Constitution. That'll be at Stern at noon. All of these events are streamed live over YouTube and then will be available as video content at our website. This event tonight is streamed live over YouTube. So is the conversation with Jeffrey Rosen tomorrow. And for those of you who are here after that event, if you're at the Rosen conversation, we're also opening up the gallery at 61 Northwest Street for a kind of short open house. So if you want to stop by and see what augmented reality is really like, I'd encourage you to do so. From 1 to 2 tomorrow afternoon at 61 Northwest Street. So now, I'd like to introduce Eric Foner. He is probably one of the most distinguished historians of our generation in the United States. He has headed every major historical organization in the country. He has won the Pulitzer Prize, the Bancroft Prize. For somebody like me who grew up studying American history, he's always been a model and a legend in some respects. He's written about all eras of 19th century American history, the antebellum Republican Party, the Underground Railroad, Reconstruction. His book on Reconstruction is why we're here. He calls it the Unfinished Revolution. That book has reshaped the way Americans study that period. And you know, especially today, especially in our climate, there is an unbelievable connection to the problems and challenges that we face. And so tonight, when Eric talks about the significance of Reconstruction in American history, I think it's something that brings it to the present day and will make it incredibly relevant and powerful for all of us. Whether you're a student of American history like I am, or like the students in my classes who are here, and I see you all, or whether you're just someone who's here for a good, engaged public lecture. So in that vein, I want to bring Eric Foner to the podium and thank him for coming to Dickinson, and let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Matt, very much for that very kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here at Dickinson to talk to you about the Reconstruction period in American history. When I'm finished, I would be delighted to field questions for a while or comments, suggestions, so please feel free once I'm finished to continue the conversation. I'm going to speak tonight about this period which we call Reconstruction, immediately after the American Civil War. Or maybe I should say Reconstruction is both a time period which is variously dated 1865 to 1877, or maybe 1863 to 1877. But it's also a historical process. And as a process, it doesn't have a very fixed ending time. The process by which the United States tried to come to terms with the consequences of the American Civil War, the two most important of which, of course, were the preservation of the American nation state and the destruction of the institution of slavery. And one might almost say that we are still in the process of working out the consequences of the end of slavery for American society. Now, as was mentioned, I've devoted a lot of my academic career to the study of Reconstruction. I've written a number of books about it. I've curated a museum exhibition which traveled around the country in the 1990s. I was an advisor to a public broadcasting TV series about Reconstruction 10 years ago or something like that. But I have to acknowledge that rather few Americans know very much about Reconstruction. Back in the 1990s, the Department of Education conducted some kind of survey. They do this occasionally, survey of to find out what people know about American history. And this was a survey of about 16,000 graduating seniors from American high schools. And they were asked to say something intelligible about various things in American history, okay? Like the westward movement or the civil rights era or something like that. Well, 80% could say something about the westward movement, dropping of the first atomic bomb, et cetera. But anyway, at the bottom of the list, the absolute lowest thing on the whole list was Reconstruction. Only about 20% of these graduating seniors could say anything about the Reconstruction period. I had recently published a 600-page book on Reconstruction, so I found this disheartening. But the fact is that even if we're not aware of it, Reconstruction is, in a sense, part of our lives today, right now, in the United States. Or to put it another way, some of the key questions facing American society, some of which are being debated as we speak in the presidential campaigns, are Reconstruction questions. Or what I mean is you can't really understand them today without knowing something about the Reconstruction period, which is now 150 years ago. Let me just make a point about the uniqueness, in a way, of Reconstruction in American history. Everybody in the world maybe knows that Barack Obama is the first black president of the United States. Whether you like him or don't, he's the first black president. That's 1 out of 44. We've had 44 presidents, I think, depending on how you count Grover Cleveland, once or twice. But anyway, 1 out of 44. How many African Americans have served in the U.S. Senate? That's not an easy question to answer because there have been a few lately. In fact, right now is the only time in all of American history that there are 2 black persons serving simultaneously in the U.S. Senate. Scott of South Carolina, and Booker of New Jersey. But basically, over the course of all of American history, there have been about 2,000 U.S. senators, and of those, 9 have been African American. And of those 9, about 6 were in the last 10, 15 years. But anyway, 9 out of 2,000 is a much worse percentage than 1 out of 44. But 2 of those 9 were in Reconstruction. The first 2 African Americans to serve in the U.S. Senate, Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, both from Mississippi, served at different times during Reconstruction. My point there is simply that Reconstruction was a fairly unique moment in the history of American democracy, and I will talk about that a lot more in a minute. Matt used the word relevance for Reconstruction, which is certainly, it's a much abused term, but it does apply here very strongly. As I said, issues that are on our agenda today are Reconstruction questions. Who is an American citizen, or who should be allowed to be an American citizen? That's a Reconstruction issue. It's very much alive in our political debates, as you all know. Citizenship was defined legally, constitutionally, in Reconstruction. The relationship between the federal government and the states. Who has the ultimate responsibility for protecting the basic rights of American citizens? What is the balance of power within the federal system? That's a Reconstruction question. That was debated and redefined during Reconstruction. Terrorism. I don't need to tell you, this is on the front page of our newspapers. Terrorism is a Reconstruction question. Reconstruction was a period of homegrown American terrorism. The Ku Klux Klan and kindred organizations like that in the South in Reconstruction were terrorist organizations. And indeed, if you add them all up, they probably resulted in the deaths of more American citizens than died on September 11th, 2001 at the hands of Osama bin Laden. How do you deal with terrorism? How do you suppress it? That's a Reconstruction problem. Affirmative action, or to put it, that term didn't exist in Reconstruction, but the issue of what the nation should do, if anything, to compensate, you might say, for many, many years of inequality, in that case, slavery, that's a Reconstruction question. Should you be color blind, or should you say, no, here's a group that has been severely oppressed for many years, and now something positive needs to be done to redress that. That was debated in Reconstruction. What is the relationship between political democracy and economic democracy? That's a Reconstruction question. The former slaves came out of slavery, obviously with very little economic wherewithal, without property, most of them, as we will see. They demanded that the government give them land as a kind of compensation for their, what Lincoln in his second inaugural called their 250 years of unrequited labor, unpaid labor. Can you enjoy your political rights if you're economically impoverished and insecure? That was debated vigorously in Reconstruction. We even recently, it hasn't really come to that, but over the past few years, there was a kind of a debate over whether the United States would sort of reach its debt limit, the national debt limit, and maybe have to default on our national debt. That's a Reconstruction question. The 14th Amendment put into our Constitution that the government had to, the language was rather odd, but it basically said that you could not challenge the validity of the national debt. In fact, there were some people, when Congress was threatening not to extend the debt limit, there were some people who said, well, President Obama could just do it himself because that's in the Constitution because of Reconstruction. Anyway, my point is that you can't understand American history without knowing something about Reconstruction. But the most important, maybe, is, as I said, that Reconstruction was a pivotal moment in the history of American democracy. 50 years before my book on Reconstruction came out, a great classic of American history was written by the great scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois called Black Reconstruction in America. And the subtitle of that said this was an episode in the history of American democracy. And Du Bois was quite right about that. He identified it, the attempt to reconstruct democracy in America, he said. The first time an interracial democracy was attempted in this country, where African American men were given the right to vote, the right to hold office, and governments came into power in the South, which were interracial governments for the first time in our history. And today, when our democracy seems to be, let us say, ailing in some regards, it's riddled with problems from the, not to get into politics, but let us say the low level to which political discourse has fallen in this presidential campaign, not to mention the inordinate impact of money on political democracy here. Reconstruction reminds us both of the radical promise of democracy and the fragility of political democracy as well. Now, Reconstruction is also, one other thing, before I get into some other elements of the history, a prime example of what we sometimes call the politics of history. The politics of history. I'm not talking exactly about whether the historian is a Republican or a Democrat or something like that. I mean by the politics of history the way in which historical interpretation both reflects and helps to shape the political world that the historian is living in and writing in. For many, many years, really for most of the 20th century, what we call the sort of old or standard view of Reconstruction dominated historical writing and textbooks and popular thinking. And in that view, in a nutshell, it was a complicated view, the Reconstruction period after the Civil War was the sort of lowest point in the whole history of American democracy. In that view, which one still hears echoes of around, even though it has been pretty much repudiated by historians, in that view, at the time he died or was assassinated, President Lincoln was committed to bringing the defeated South back into the Union in a quick, forgiving, lenient manner. After his death, his policy was continued by his successor, Andrew Johnson, who became president. Johnson was thwarted, according to this, by the radical Republicans in Congress, who were motivated, depending on which historian you read, either by just irrational vindictiveness toward the white South or by a desire to fasten the grip of Northern capitalism on the South, or just the desire to keep the Republican Party in power. But at any rate, they overthrew the Lincoln-Johnson plan and imposed black suffrage, that is, the right to vote for black men in the old Confederacy. And in this view, black people were just simply incapable of exercising democratic rights. They just didn't have the capacity to do that. They should not be part of our democracy. And therefore, what happened was an orgy of corruption and misgovernment presided over the sort of trio of leaders of the Reconstruction South. Carpetbaggers, that is, Northerners who came down to the South supposedly to reap the spoils of office, scalawags who were white Southerners who betrayed their race by joining up with blacks, and the African Americans themselves. And under their rule, there was this misgovernment in the South, and eventually patriotic groups like the Ku Klux Klan kind of organized and overthrew these governments and restored what was politely called home rule to the South, or what we would honestly call white supremacy in the southern states. Now, this view received scholarly expression in works produced originally at my university, Columbia, by William Dunning and his students. It's often called the Dunning School of Reconstruction history. It reached a mass audience in the film Birth of a Nation, which came out in 1915 and actually had its premiere in the White House when Woodrow Wilson was president. And Birth of a Nation, if you haven't seen it, is just a glorification of the Ku Klux Klan and a complete representation of African Americans as just above the level of savages, basically. And also national bestsellers like The Tragic Era, written by Claude Bowers in the 1920s. Okay, now, the politics of history. That point of view had an amazing longevity. Historians basically make their living by repealing or revoking what other historians have written, by revising history. That's what we do. We're just constantly changing what other people have done. To remain the standard interpretation for 50 or 60 years is unprecedented. I can't think of any other field of history, of American history, where one point of view dominated for 50 or 60 years. How did that happen? What explains that longevity? What explains it is that this old view was congruent with the actual racial system of the United States, particularly the South, in the period from 1900 up to the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s. Because the political lessons of the old view of Reconstruction wasn't just a view of history, it was a view of racial politics. What were its lessons? One, it was a big mistake to give black people the right to vote in Reconstruction. That was the cause of all the problems. Therefore, the white South was correct to take away the right to vote, as it did in the period 1890 to about 1906. One state or another revoked the right to vote for black men. And any effort to give them back this basic democratic right would just lead to all the evils of Reconstruction again. So therefore, any efforts to restore the right to vote would just, you'd have another Reconstruction on your hands. Secondly, Reconstruction was imposed on the South by Northerners, some maybe well-meaning. I mean, Thaddeus Stevens, who came from around here, was a humanitarian, etc. But the basic point was that Northerners don't understand the South. Only white Southerners really understand race relations in the South, and therefore the white South should resist outside pressures for change. And if they didn't, all the horrors of Reconstruction would be repeated. And finally, the third lesson, which seems a little arcane at the moment, is that Reconstruction was created by the Republican Party. And the Republican Party could not be trusted. The South must remain what it was for a long time. Of course, it no longer is, the solid Democratic South. If you vote Republican, you're going to have another Reconstruction. So, for example, the book I just mentioned, The Tragic Era by Bowers, a complete fantasy of Reconstruction history, Bowers said crazy things like, rape is the product of Reconstruction. There was no rape in the South before Reconstruction. Of course, the rape of thousands of black women as slaves didn't count in Bowers's calculation here. But why did he write that book? He wrote it in 1929. Bowers was not actually a professional historian. He was a Democratic newspaper editor in Indiana. In the presidential election of 1928, for the first time since Reconstruction, the Republican candidate, Herbert Hoover, had carried several southern states. Why? Because the Democrat was Al Smith, a Roman Catholic, and many Southerners didn't want to vote for a Roman Catholic, and they voted for Hoover. And Bowers was alarmed. He said, uh-oh, the Republicans are making inroads in the South. We better remind people of the horrors of Reconstruction, to remind them that you must stay with the Democratic Party. So, all right, so that's the politics of the old view. The Civil Rights Revolution, which, by the way, was called in the 1960s the Second Reconstruction, swept away the fundamental pillars of the old view. That is to say, the basic pillar was just black inferiority. Once you reject that and say, no, black people are just as capable as anyone else of taking part in political, life, then the whole edifice of the old view fell to the ground. And today, and the era was completely misinterpreted. I think today most scholars view Reconstruction as a praiseworthy, if unsuccessful, effort to establish, as I said, for the first time in American history, an interracial democracy. The tragedy of the era was not that Reconstruction was attempted, but that it failed, and therefore left to subsequent generations this difficult problem of racial justice in America. Now, Reconstruction was a radical departure from the previous history of the United States, no question about that, and it's understandable that it aroused a lot of resistance from people who were unable to make that leap, so to speak. I'm not going to give you the whole history of the United States before the Civil War, but let us just remember that on the eve of the Civil War, 1860, there were 4 million, more or less, African Americans in the country. 3.9 million of them were slaves. There were 500,000, so there's 4.4 million. 500,000 were free blacks who enjoyed a few rights, but very, very few. Slavery was by far the most powerful economic institution in the United States, and slavery shaped the whole consciousness or concept of American nationality and citizenship. On the eve of the Civil War, the law of the land, as laid down by the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision, was that no black person could be a citizen of the United States. Citizenship was just for whites. And they're not just talking about slaves, they're talking about free people whose ancestors might have been in the United States for 200 years, but nonetheless, they could not be American citizens. Now, I don't emphasize this to say, oh, look how bad people were before the Civil War, but just to point out the remarkable change that the Civil War and Reconstruction brought about in our concept of American, in the definition of America itself, a concept of nationality. Now, before the war, there was a small group that put forward an alternative vision of a racially equal democracy. That was the abolitionist movement. But the abolitionists were a fairly small group, except for a few regions of the country. They fought for not only the end of slavery, but the incorporation of blacks as equal members of American society. And that is indeed what came about as a result of the Civil War and Reconstruction. The most important thing, I think, that put the question of black citizenship on the national agenda was the destruction of slavery, obviously, but also the service of 200,000 black men in the Union Army and Navy in the last 2 years of the Civil War. By the end of the war, it had become widely accepted that serving in the Army, by serving in the Army, blacks had staked a claim to citizenship in the post-war nation. Abraham Lincoln himself, who had never publicly supported the right to vote for African Americans, in his last speech in April 1865, shortly before his assassination, said that he had basically changed his mind and that some black people ought to be given the right to vote in Reconstruction. He said, who? Well, he said the very intelligent, that is, there was a free black group, he's particularly talking about Louisiana, propertied, educated, free blacks. In New Orleans, they were certainly as capable of voting as most white people. But he also added those who serve our cause as soldiers. The soldiers, most of them not former free people, but former slaves, had earned the right to vote by fighting and dying for the Union. So when Lincoln died, he didn't have a clear plan of Reconstruction. He had tried a number of different things during the war, but it was clear that now that the war was over, some new approach was needed, and he hinted at that in this speech. Anyway, within a week or two, Lincoln was dead, and he was succeeded by Andrew Johnson. Johnson is a strong candidate for the label of the worst president in American history. There is competition, but Johnson is a contender. Johnson was not the man for the job. He lacked all the qualities of greatness that Lincoln had. He was deeply, deeply racist. He had no real sense of Northern public sentiment. He was really a Democrat who had been put on the ticket to balance it and to get votes in the Upper South. He was inflexible. He lacked Lincoln's open-mindedness. He was incapable of dealing with Congress, and he thought that the freed people should just go back to work on the plantations and have no real right to take part in American government. Johnson set up new governments in the South in 1865, controlled by whites, with blacks having no role whatsoever. These governments enacted a series of laws we call the Black Codes to sort of define and limit the freedom which African Americans had now achieved. It's all complicated, but the basic point is the Black Codes tried to use the power of the government to force the former slaves back to work on the plantations under white control. Any black person who didn't go to work for a white man was considered a vagrant who could be arrested and fined and basically sold for the year to a white employer. These laws gave them certain rights, like the right to marry without their marriages being broken up, as it happened under slavery, the right to own property, but no political rights, no civil rights, and put them in a position of severe economic inequality. The point of these Black Codes was not how effective they were, because they were mostly overruled pretty quickly by the Freedmen's Bureau and was soon afterwards repealed, but they turned Northern public opinion against Johnson's policy. It seemed that Johnson had put into power people who were trying to restore slavery in all but name, as well as ex-Confederates coming into control of the Southern governments. So Congress very quickly decided that Johnson's policy had to be amended. And the way to do that was to pass some laws to make sure that the Southern states acted in a more equitable manner. And the result of that was the Civil Rights Act of 1866, one of the most important laws in American history, still on the books today. Civil Rights Act of 1866. This is the origin of the concept of civil rights as a legal matter in the United States. It was the first law to declare who is a citizen of the United States. Up to that point, it was the states that determined citizenship, and it varied very greatly from state to state. Who is a citizen of the United States, and what rights are these citizens going to enjoy? The Civil Rights Act states that any person born in the United States is a citizen. This is the concept we call birthright citizenship. Now, parentheses, there is a concept out there, which is actually a little bit of a part of our presidential campaign, known as American exceptionalism. Some of the Republican candidates complain, among other things, that President Obama does not believe in American exceptionalism. Basically, they say, American exceptionalism, we are better, we are different and much better than anybody else. And everybody else ought to try to be just like us. Of course, if they did, then we wouldn't be exceptional anymore, but let's not worry about that. And therefore, we don't have the right, we don't need to know anything about anybody else, actually, because their experience is completely irrelevant to our experience. But I think American exceptionalism is largely a myth, but in this case, it is true. Birthright citizenship is an example of our exceptionalism. There is no country in Europe today which has birthright citizenship. In other words, you can be born in England or in Germany or in France, and depending on where your parents are from, you may not be a citizen of that country. This is an issue today, as I say, in our presidential campaign, because there are some states, notably Arizona, actually. I don't have anything against Arizona, but they are a little weird down there. And in Arizona, the legislature keeps trying to figure out ways to deny citizenship to children of parents who are not legally in the United States. Now, the point of birthright citizenship was then written into the 14th Amendment, as we'll see in a minute. No state, including Arizona, has the right so far to abrogate the Constitution of the United States. But more to the point is, this is a statement of principle, that anybody can be an American citizen. It doesn't matter where you are from. It doesn't matter what your religion is. It doesn't matter who your parents are. It doesn't matter. Anybody born here has the capability of being a citizen, and that's the abolitionist vision of American society, now put into the law and quickly after that into the 14th Amendment. But let's go back to the Civil Rights Act. All right, they're all citizens. By the way, this overturns the Dred Scott decision. It had been pretty much ignored anyway, but by the Lincoln administration. But now this invalidates the Dred Scott decision on black citizenship. What rights are all these citizens going to enjoy? Well, the Civil Rights Act lists rights which all citizens are to enjoy, protected by the federal government. No state can deny citizens. What they basically say are the rights of what we call free labor, the right to compete in the marketplace, the right to own property, to go to court, to sign labor contracts or any kind of contract. What's interesting about the Civil Rights Act is it says all citizens are to enjoy these rights the same as are enjoyed the same way as white people. Interesting. The same as white people. In laws before the Civil War, the concept of whiteness was used as an exclusion. Only whites can vote. Only whites can serve in the militia. Whiteness there is a boundary. Here, whiteness becomes a kind of baseline. If white people have a certain right, everyone else has to have that right also. An interesting way of describing legal equality. And as I say, this is a complete repudiation of the legal history of the United States up to that time, because every state in the Union had laws of one kind or another discriminating on the basis of race. Well, of course, a law can be repealed by the next Congress, so very quickly Congress decided to put this concept into the Constitution in the 14th Amendment, which passed Congress, was approved by Congress in the spring of 1866 and then eventually ratified by the states. The most important change in our Constitution since the Bill of Rights. It writes this concept of equal citizenship and birthright citizenship, equal citizenship into the Constitution for the first time. The word equal is not in the original Constitution, except in the clause declaring how many senators each state can have. They have an equal number of senators, 2. But that's not what we generally mean by equality when we talk about it. The 14th Amendment puts this notion of equality among citizens into the Constitution, and it makes the Constitution what it was not before the Civil War, but would become in the 20th and now 21st century, a vehicle that people who feel they're denied equality can appeal to. And that process has been going on certainly for the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years. And the concept of equality, of course, is expansionary. The most recent important use of the 14th Amendment came in the decision preventing states from denying the right to marriage to homosexual couples, right? Justice Kennedy's opinion in that was based on the 14th Amendment. And of course, gay marriage was not on the agenda of Congress in 1866, right? But what Kennedy said very eloquently was our concepts of liberty and equality evolve. It doesn't mean the same thing now. This is a repudiation of, the late Justice Scalia's view that the Constitution only means what the guys in 1866 or 1789 thought it meant. It never changes. Kennedy said, no, it changes. Our concept of liberty changes. Our concept of equality changes. We don't have to be locked 150 years ago and just keep reenacting the prejudices of earlier times. So the 14th Amendment changes the whole definition of who is an American and what the meaning of citizenship is. It also changes the federal system, the relationship between the federal government and the states. The Civil War had crystallized in the minds of Northerners the idea of a powerful national government protecting the rights of all Americans. You can see the point I'm making if you compare the 14th Amendment actually the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 13th abolished slavery, the 14th creates this equal citizenship, and the 15th, we'll see in a minute, tries to give the right to vote to black men in the South. Each one of them ends with a clause saying, Congress shall have the power to enforce this amendment by appropriate legislation. Congress shall. The Supreme Court has forgotten about that, unfortunately, at least a majority of it, in their decision recently invalidating the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They forgot that Congress had been given the power in the 15th Amendment to enforce the right to vote for black people, but the Supreme Court said, we never heard of that. Anyway, compare that language with the Bill of Rights. What are the first words of the Bill of Rights? First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, et cetera, freedom of the press. Congress shall have the power versus Congress shall make no law. The Bill of Rights is a restriction on the powers of Congress. It was based on the idea that a too powerful federal government is the greatest danger to liberty. Now, after the Civil War, it is the states that are seen as the danger to liberty. It was the states that had created slavery, and it was the states that were now trying to deprive black people of their basic rights. And so it is the federal government that becomes what Charles Sumner called the custodian of freedom. You need a powerful federal government. So the balance within the federal system shifts from the states to the federal government. Before the Civil War, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. It was only a restriction on the central government. Since then, the federal courts, Congress, et cetera, over time have expanded greatly the rights of Americans. Now, the 14th Amendment said nothing about the right to vote except a convoluted clause I'm not going to go into about taking away some representation of states if they didn't give black men the right to vote. But basically, Congress quickly decided that the governments set up by Andrew Johnson were just no good and had to be replaced. And in 1867, they passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which says there got to be new governments in the South, get rid of those Johnson governments, and the new governments have to be based on universal manhood suffrage. Unfortunately, at this time, women did not vote in any state and wouldn't for a good while. All men, black men included, must have the right to vote in the new governments created in the South. In the South, this did not apply to the North. But then in 1869 and ratified in 1870 comes the 15th Amendment to give black men the right to vote throughout the nation. Now, at that time, over 90% of blacks lived in the South, very few in the North. But still, the 15th Amendment is the last of these Reconstruction amendments. But the 15th Amendment was a weaker amendment. The radical Republicans wanted an affirmative amendment, which simply said every male citizen aged 21 or over has the right to vote. No state can take it away for any reason. But that's not what it ended up saying. What it ended up saying was a state cannot take, that the right to vote cannot be denied on the basis of race. Okay? Black men cannot be denied on the basis of race. But it left open all these other possible, not intentionally, well, it did, it certainly, sex was not in there. States could certainly deny women the right to vote, and did continue to do that. But it inadvertently left open other ways of denying people the right to vote, which would be implemented after Reconstruction is overthrown. Poll taxes, that is, charging people for the right to vote. That's not on the basis of race. Literacy tests, understanding clauses, which say, well, you can't vote unless you understand these clauses of the state constitution, which the registrar will. All sorts of ways which on the face of it are not racial, but which in the end actually were used to completely eliminate the black vote in the South without violating the 15th Amendment. But anyway, the Reconstruction Act of 1867 inaugurated the period we call radical Reconstruction, where new governments came to power throughout the South and, in a sense, you might say, tried to wrench the South into the 19th century. They created the first public school systems in Southern history. Southern states had not had public schools, except North Carolina, before the Civil War. Now they built public schools for both black and white children. They tried to rebuild the Southern economy, which was a very difficult thing to do after the devastation of the Civil War. They passed state-level civil rights legislation to try to prevent discrimination by railroad companies and hotels and theaters and restaurants and things like that. They tried to protect the rights of black laborers on the plantations. Black men held public office in Reconstruction at every level, from the two I mentioned in the U.S. Senate. I think there were 16 members of the House of Representatives. There were many, many members of the legislature, constitutional conventions, and then down to school board officials, sheriffs, justices of the peace. Most power remained in the hands of white Republicans. The idea of this as black supremacy, which was circulated by the old school, was certainly not true. Most of the power was in white hands, but still, the presence of maybe 2,000 black men in one or another position of public office during the period of Reconstruction was a remarkable, radical change in American democracy. Considering that before the Civil War, I don't think more than 3 or 4 black people held any public office, all in the North. There was a guy in Oberlin, there was a Justice of the Peace in Massachusetts, maybe a couple of others, but that was pretty much about it. So Reconstruction, as I said, was the time of a remarkable experiment in actual democracy. But of course, the problems of former slaves coming out of slavery were not just political, they were economic as well. And here is where Reconstruction did not move forward. One historian has written, the political revolution went forward, but the economic revolution did not accompany it. The demand, request, desire for 40 acres of land and a mule, people who don't know anything about Reconstruction know the phrase 40 acres and a mule, partly because it's the name of Spike Lee's film company. It didn't happen. Land was not distributed. One of the things Andrew Johnson did as soon as he got into office was to order that there had been a lot of land that fell into the hands of the Freedmen's Bureau, abandoned land in the South. And the Freedmen's Bureau bill, which was passed in March 1865, anticipated that land being at least rented to black families, maybe not given to them. General Sherman had settled black families on a lot of land in South Carolina, Sherman's famous Field Order 15, but all that land was returned to the former owners at the order of President Jackson. So, as I say, political democracy went forward, but economic democracy did not. Most African Americans remained poor, propertyless, with little alternative but to go to work for white employers of one kind or another. But the political revolution was dramatic enough that it inspired, as I said, this violent opposition. The Ku Klux Klan and kindred organizations, the White League in Louisiana, the Red Shirts in South Carolina, Knights of the White Camellia. One shouldn't think of the Ku Klux Klan as a highly centralized, organization with a single leader. It was just a lot of local groups with the same basic aim, to restore white supremacy, and willing to use violence, assassination, arson, intimidation to do that. Now, President Grant, who was elected in 1868 after Johnson, Congress passed laws authorizing the president to use federal force to suppress violent terrorist organizations. And in 1871, he sent troops and marshals into South Carolina and crushed the Klan. You can do that if you will play tough with them. Ironically, many Klan leaders in South Carolina fled to Canada to avoid prosecution. Before the war, slaves seeking freedom escaped to Canada. Now, Ku Klux Klansmen escaped to Canada to avoid prosecution. But Grant did crush the Klan, and in fact, violence subsided very dramatically in 1871, 72. But then it reared its head again in the middle 1870s for complicated reasons, one of them having to do with the onset of a serious economic depression in 1873, which shifted the whole discourse of national politics away from Reconstruction and toward the economic problems of unemployment, business failures, etc. It led to the congressional elections of 1874, giving the Democrats a majority in the House of Representatives for the first time since the Civil War, which meant that there was not going to be any more federal action against violence in the South. And to make a complicated story shorter, because it happened in a different way in each state, by 1877, the Democrats had come back into power in every southern state, and Reconstruction was over as a period when the federal government was committed in some way to protecting the basic rights of these black citizens in the South. Now, I'm just about at the end of my time. One could now tell a long story about what happened between the end of Reconstruction and the Civil Rights era. By the turn of the century, a new racial system was in place in the South. We call it Jim Crow as a kind of shorthand. It was a system of racial domination based on segregation, disenfranchisement of black voters, the collapse of black education in many areas, a rigidly segmented labor market where the good jobs were reserved for white people, and violence, lynching, etc. And this could not have happened without the acquiescence of the North, of Northern politicians, Northern public, and of course the Supreme Court, which over a series of years stripped away basically the enforcement possibilities of the Reconstruction legislation and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Those amendments remained on the books, though. They were never repealed. They were abrogated in the South. They were violated with impunity. But eventually, when the Civil Rights Revolution took place, they could turn back to the 14th and 15th Amendments as the legal basis for the overthrow, basically, of the segregationist system in the South. So what might we say about this in conclusion? What are the lessons? Well, one is that rights on the books are not necessarily self-enforcing. The 14th Amendment remained part of the Constitution, but it was ignored for many, many decades. The civil rights laws remained on the books, but ignored. In other words, as an old phrase goes, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. You can't just take it for granted. But the fact that those things were there was important. You know, when South Africa, they were what Charles Sumner called, the great senator from Massachusetts, sleeping giants in the Constitution. When South Africa abolished apartheid in the 1990s, they had to write a new constitution. They had an apartheid constitution. The Civil Rights Revolution in this country did not change the Constitution, except for one amendment about poll taxes. That was minor. We had a constitution. What we needed was a government that would enforce it. And eventually that happened. So during the Civil War, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, an abolitionist from Boston who was a commander of one of the early units of black soldiers in the war in South Carolina, Higginson wrote, revolutions may go backwards. In a sense, he was warning again about the fragility of democratic change. Reconstruction was a revolution, but then it went backwards. And in some ways, as I say, we are still living with the consequences of that history. So thank you very much for listening.
Hello. Let me make that. Well, thank you. While Eric gets a drink of water, let me make a quick comment and then remind you about the logistics of the questions. So first of all, I think I can speak on behalf of the entire Dickinson community when I say, although you said many wise things, right? The wisest, from our perspective, was that he identified Andrew Johnson as the worst president in American history, thereby categorically proving that Dickinson graduate James Buchanan was no worse than the second worst president in American history. So for that, we thank you. So Christina and Major are two interns at the House Divided Project. They'll be walking around with microphones. When you want to ask questions, Eric will be happy to take them. We have plenty of time for questions. I have students here. I hope they ask questions. For those of you, as we break up afterwards, however, I just want to remind you there's a bookseller, Jim Schmick, from the Civil War Roundtable community outside. He's selling Eric's books. Eric is willing to sign those books afterwards as well, and they do take credit cards. So all of that is available for your interest, but for now, why don't we open the floor up to questions, and Eric, I'll let you
Okay, thank
direct.
you, Matt. Okay, so anyone has a question, I invite you to raise your hand, and let us see who wants to be the first to raise a question. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so wait until the microphone comes over to you.
Hi, I'm not a scholar, and this is not my era by any means, but I found that very interesting. But I do have a question. The current reference to democracy and your reference to democracy, are we not a republic? And can you explain that difference? And also, just quickly, in as many short words as you can, did you enjoy and did you think that Steven Spielberg's film on Lincoln was accurate?
I've been asked that many a time, that's why I left. We are a republic and a democracy, I would say. A republic is a representative democracy. That is to say, it is a government based upon the will of the people, as Lincoln said at Gettysburg, but through representatives. It is not like an Athenian democracy where the entire population, or that is to say the citizens, most of them were slaves in Athens, but the citizens come together to pass laws. But obviously we have representatives. Not all our representatives are the highest caliber nowadays, but we are also a democracy in the sense that that is what Americans think of themselves as. When Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States in 1830 or 30, I guess, and he came from France to write a book about American prisons. And he got here and he started talking to people and he said, you know, I'm writing the wrong book here. Prisons is not the question here. It's democracy. This is what is on the minds of Americans. They think of themselves as a democracy. I better write about democracy because that is going to be coming to Europe eventually. He didn't much like the idea. He was an aristocrat. So we are a republic, but we are also a democracy. And if you ask your man or woman in the street, they will certainly say this is a democracy. So I think the old, not that you're a member of this, the old John Birch Society slogan, "We are a republic, not a democracy," is absurd because everybody, unless you're going to say a democracy is a society where every single person is a legislator, but that's not, nobody uses the word democracy to mean that anymore. We use it as Lincoln did at Gettysburg, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and that's how most people, I think, understand the concept. Now, as to the Lincoln movie, how many hours do you have? Let me just say the following. I am not a fan of Hollywood history. Hollywood is Hollywood, and history is history, and they should each do their own thing and not bother each other. The Lincoln movie was an excellent piece of historical fiction. There's nothing wrong with historical fiction. Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, great play. Do you think that's what ancient Rome was like? Do you think that's what Brutus was like? I was sitting in my office talking to a young woman student who asked me your very question. Next door, our door was open. Next door to me is Professor William Harris, a great scholar of ancient Rome. And he walked by. I said, William, get in here for a second. Let's answer this question right now. Was Brutus like the real Brutus? Was he like the guy, the noblest Roman of them all? No, he said, are you kidding? He was a scoundrel. He was a conspirator. Shakespeare's Brutus. So, yeah, there was Lincoln. The movie is historical fiction. It is there's good acting. The costumes are okay. But the fundamental premise of the movie is false. Other than that, it's fine historically. The premise is that Lincoln was torn between ending the war and ending slavery. He had to choose one or the other, and he chose ending slavery and pushing the 13th Amendment through Congress. That is completely false. By that time, it was absolutely clear, and Lincoln had made it clear, there was no way the war was going to end with slavery still intact. I don't care what amendment was passed, what law, that choice didn't, but dramatically, it makes good sense. A choice between two goods, peace and ending slavery, is a dramatic concept. A choice between a good and an evil is not very interesting. So they created this false choice for Lincoln in order to show him as someone balancing these things. But, I could go into many. The other thing is, there was no black presence in this movie. Yeah, there was the woman who worked in the White House, Mrs. Keckley, but, it's too claustrophobic. It's the inside the Beltway. Slavery didn't just end because Lincoln told Congress to pass an amendment. It was ending on the ground with black people running away, to joining the army, running to the Union lines, burning. By this time, they're burning plantations in South Carolina. This is the inside the Beltway concept of how slavery ended. But it wasn't just a little debating society. This was a violent revolution going on in the South, and you get no sense. And I will finish on this by just saying, this will surprise you. You get a better sense of what was going on in the country in another movie, which came out a year before this, Abraham Lincoln, the Vampire Hunter. Yes. That's not accurate either. There was not a vampire army at Gettysburg. But it gets out into the society. You see Illinois, you see the South, you see the world, you see black people. You actually see America in the Civil War where you don't have any sense of that. All right, anyway, I'm going to stop. I could keep going on about this. Who else has a question? Yes, over here.
Major, go up to one of the students up top first.
Oh, all right, we'll go to students first. Good, I didn't see them up there.
Hello there. Do you think there's been a renewed interest in Reconstruction history because of the recent renewed interest in reparations, especially from the Atlantic articles from Coates?
You got to repeat the question for me because my hearing is not so good.
If you think the article by Ta-Nehisi Coates about reparations has sparked any new interest in
Yeah,
reparations?
a good
Maybe
question.
You want to comment on reparations?
Yeah, Ta-Nehisi Coates, very prominent now, black journalist, writer, a couple of years ago now in The Atlantic, wrote this long article about reparations is an issue which has been around in one form or another since the Civil War, even though the term is a fairly recent one. 40 acres and a mule could be considered reparations. In fact, there's a famous speech by a former slave, I quote in my book, where he specifically says, why should we get land? Because our labor has built up the wealth of the South, and we deserve payment for that. Is that reparations? Well, yeah, I didn't use the word, but that's the concept. Later on in the 1890s, a black woman, Callie House, led a campaign for pensions, federal pensions for former slaves. Civil War soldiers got pensions. Why shouldn't slaves, ex-slaves, now elderly, get pensions from the federal government? That would be a kind of reparations. Marcus Garvey talked about reparations. Malcolm X talked about reparations. And the issue, so now Coates, what's interesting is, and I think correctly, Coates is talking about reparations not just for slavery. Injustice against black people didn't end with the end of slavery. There's another, after Reconstruction, another 70, 80 years of deep injustice in segregation. And even today, I mean, you've got to pick up your newspaper and see that, it's no longer Bull Connor with his dogs, It's like a guy in a three-piece suit at Wells Fargo Bank who is refusing to give African Americans anything but subprime mortgages, even though they have the same income as whites who are getting regular mortgages. I just pick out Wells Fargo because they had to pay a big fine when that came out. But that's continuous racism, not just in the past. So, you know, it's a legitimate debate. And to me, it's a non-starter politically. Or let me put it this way. If the situation existed where Congress was willing to provide reparations of some kind, you wouldn't need reparations. Because then you would have what you really need, which is social policy. We don't need reparations. We need social policy to address the continuing racial inequalities in this country. I don't want to call it reparations. I just think that we are a society which ought to do something about that. You know, when, you know, and, you know, a lot of people think we're in a post-racial society. Well, pick up the New York Times today and read the article about the government commission which investigated the Flint water supply. If you think we're post-racial, try to explain why a city which is mostly black is poisoning its own children with public water in order to save money for the state. And as this commission, which was appointed by the Republican governor, said, you think this would have happened in a white suburb? Come on, you know, what planet are you living on? So, you know, we need a policy, we need to get to a situation where that could not happen. Whether you call that reparations or just justice, I don't know. But I don't think the concept of reparations is a politically viable, but what Coates is really doing, and he does have a serious interest in history, is saying people have to take a careful look at our history. If, you know, to know where we are, how we got to where we are today, let us look at the history of race in America. And he wrote a long, that's what his long article is really about. Okay, why don't you call on people? You know better than I who should be.
Here we have a couple hands over here, Major. Why don't you come down here?
All right, we got one and then here.
Can you speak to the process of ratifying the 13th Amendment, especially with regard to the 11 southern states? Did they have any meaningful part in that process?
This is about
the ratification of the 13th Amendment. He wants to know whether Southerners were coerced.
Oh, yeah, of course they were. President Johnson said, you can't get back into the Union until you ratify the 13th Amendment. That's all. He laid down what were considered very mild conditions for these Southern governments he created to return to their representation in Congress and being in the Union. One, they had to acknowledge the end of slavery in their own laws and ratify the 13th Amendment. And two, they had to repudiate the Confederate debt. In other words, they couldn't pay off the bonds, you know, the borrowing that had been done. But in other words, they had to admit they lost the war. That's what it was. You lost the war, so the money that was patriotically loaned to the Confederate government is gone, folks. You're not getting it back. And second of all, slavery's over. Nothing you can do about that. And so, yes, to get the final states, 3 or 4, you know, you need 3/4 of the states. Even though just about all the northern states ratified, you still needed some southern. So, yes, you could call it coercion. The Supreme Court has never touched that one with a 10-foot pole. You know, if someone went, well, hey, wait a minute, the 13th Amendment isn't really part of the Constitution, they're not going to do anything about that, you know. It's too late. Now we have a gentleman down here.
Hi, I'm Ross Cetrick with Thaddeus Stevens Society, and first off, I just want to thank you for all your efforts at bringing about the truth about Reconstruction. It's very gratifying
You're
what
welcome.
you've done over the years. Just a couple things. As you well know, not everybody goes along with your ideas, and there continues to be pushback. You mentioned a couple different movies like Birth of a Nation. There still continues to be movie makers like Ron Maxwell, who makes Copperhead, where the Civil War is caused by crazy abolitionists, and Gods and Generals, which is now probably considered the worst movie ever made. But in any case, one question I have is, do you ever encounter pushback on your lectures? And I'm interested in the most outrageous kind of pushback you might get from an audience member. And two, also, you were talking about the media after the Civil War, basically talking about the corruption of the Reconstruction governments. Do you hear an echo in our current conservative media reaction to President Obama, where he doesn't seem to be able to do anything right from their point of view? And I guess the last thing is, how did I miss, as a student of history, during my high school years, my college years, about the involvement of 200,000 soldiers, black soldiers, until I saw the movie Glory? How was that just left out of all the history I read? I don't think I was ignorant
that's
about
fine. To start at the end, it is true that the service of African American soldiers was long forgotten, except in black communities. And I didn't read about it in my textbooks when I was in high school. This was back in the late 1950s. But that was part of a kind of, David Blight, in his great book, Race and Reunion, has explained how what he calls a reconciliationist view of the Civil War kind of triumphed by about 1900, where the causes of the war and slavery were kind of ignored, and the way both North and South whites remembered the war was basically as a sort of the gallantry of the soldiers on both sides. And it was the brothers' war. But that excluded blacks. It was white brothers against each other, and the black soldier didn't figure in that kind of picture. And once you erase slavery and emancipation from the story, the black presence kind of fades away. And you're right, it's only in the 70s and 80s that you begin to get serious scholarship again. I mean, there were some books before that about the role of black soldiers and their impact, et cetera. So, who was it? Kirk Savage wrote a book about Civil War monuments in the North. There are thousands of them, right? Every town has a little Civil War monument somewhere. The number of these monuments that has an image of a black soldier is less than a dozen. Less than a dozen of them have an actual, they have carved figures of soldiers. There's the great St. Gordon's 54th Massachusetts Memorial in Boston Common, fabulous thing, but that's about it in terms of real memorials to black soldiers, although now one lately was put up in Washington somewhere. So in other words, it does need, it's still not widely enough known. What were the other questions?
I gave Ross one question.
All right, 2 questions is enough.
We'll come back to the extra questions later, but let's see if anybody else wants to ask another question.
Okay, let's see who else. There's
We
a,
have a question online, I think. Yeah. Can you?
oh, and people can ask online. My goodness, this is high tech here.
Yeah, we have 37 people actually watching the live stream currently. Emily Newberry asks, I think that the open racial beliefs of slavery and the superficially race-neutral laws of Jim Crow are now the underlying implicit stereotypes evidenced in desperate enforcement. Your thoughts?
You got to repeat that one too.
Even I need someone to repeat that.
We couldn't quite hear you.
She says, I
why.
think that the open
the
racial...
acoustics goes this way in rooms like this, not this way, so it's a little hard to hear. Who has such great hearing that they could repeat the question? Oh, we're coming down. Okay, maybe this will be better.
We actually need the clip notes.
We're getting the actual text. We're going to the document. Thank you. Okay, that's great. Thank you.
We have a question right there.
Why? Look at all these people. I can't believe it. This is unbelievable. Modern technology. Okay. I think that the open racial beliefs of slavery and in the superficially race-neutral laws of Jim Crow are now the underlying implicit stereotypes in disparate enforcement. Your thoughts? And this actually goes back to one of your questions. On the one hand, I am a great believer, as I've said, in the relevance of history to the present. On the other hand, it's not one-to-one. It's not that we are reliving the history of Reconstruction exactly. But oddly, many of the, Andrew Johnson is still alive in our politics today. You go back and read Andrew Johnson's veto of the Civil Rights Act. Remember, I mentioned that great law. It was vetoed by Johnson and repassed by Congress over his veto. The first significant law in American history to pass over the veto of the president. You go to his arguments, what's wrong with the federal government trying to make black people citizens and give them, he says, this law discriminates against whites. This is the notion of reverse discrimination, which has been part of our politics for quite a while now. That somehow expanding the rights of blacks takes something away from white people. And you hear that, even echoes of it in some of our candidates lately. Or everything should be race neutral, right? And therefore anything done to assist blacks, he says it gives blacks all the advantage. Congress has never passed a law giving blacks advantages over whites. True enough. Trumbull says in the Senate, yeah, but white people have not been slaves for 250 years. So that's an absurd argument here in 1866. But so some of those things that are mentioned in that question that you can hear echoes today. It's not the same thing. Andrew Johnson is not in our politics today, but some of his arguments are still floating around, and that's why it's worth studying those debates about civil rights in the Reconstruction era.
All right, maybe one or two more questions.
Thanks. Eric, in other circumstances, I've heard you talk about the fact that there's no national park site related to Reconstruction, and I know you've been involved in those efforts. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Good question. Yeah, well, there are like 400 national park sites in the United States. One of the great ones is down the road here in Gettysburg. There is none, no, not one, nada, devoted to the history of Reconstruction. 16 years ago, it was a long time, then Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt called me up, totally out of the blue, and said, he said, I've read your book on Reconstruction. I said, that surprises me, Mr. Secretary. Actually, I'm nothing personal, but I don't imagine cabinet members sitting around and reading a 600-page. No, I've read it, and I want to know why there's no national park site devoted to the history of Reconstruction. And I said, well, if you read the book, you know why. But he said, well, then we got to have one, and I want you to make a report about where it should be. And I did that, and I said, it could be a lot of places, Beaufort, South Carolina, because they've got everything there. They've got, all the issues of Reconstruction, politics, economics, education, labor, they're all fought out in that one wonderful little area, Beaufort, beautiful place. Also, it was the first place really conquered by the Union Army. The Navy went in there in November 1861, and luckily all the white people immediately ran away. They didn't fight, which means that's good, because that meant all the buildings are there, because you need old buildings. So nothing was destroyed. So you have a lot of the buildings from that era still around. Robert Smalls, great black leader, was the boss, political boss of Beaufort for a long time. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, nothing ever happened. We went down there, but the Clinton administration went out, Bush came in, he appointed a Secretary of the Interior, Gail Norton, who, even though she was in Colorado, was connected to the Sons of the Confederacy or the Southern League or something. I didn't think she realized that Colorado didn't actually secede during the Civil War. But anyway, she wasn't interested, and no one else was interested. And the National Park Service, like many parts of the bureaucracy, moves very slowly. So lately, there's been another effort. Two excellent younger historians, Greg Downs and Kate Mazur, have been commissioned by the Park Service to do a tour of the South to locate what would be a good site for a national park site on Reconstruction. And they're supposed to issue their report soon, so maybe something will happen. By the way, there can be more than one, How many Civil War sites are there? More than one. So there could be 5 or 6 little places around devoted to the history of Reconstruction. But one would be a good start. And I have become less sanguine after 16 years that you're ever going to get the National Park Service to do anything. But they do seem to be making some progress nowadays. So maybe we will get such a site, which would be good for historical, education.
Okay, perhaps the last question from the student. There we go.
You mentioned President Lincoln's views on black citizenship. What would Reconstruction have looked like had he not been assassinated?
Good. All right. I'm happy to get that question. What would Reconstruction have looked like if Lincoln had not been shot? This is what we call counterfactual history, right? I don't mind answering that question because nobody can prove I'm wrong. You know, Lincoln, the thing about Lincoln, at least I argued this, is that he was a man who was very open-minded and had this great capacity for growth. Lincoln in 1858 is not the same guy as Lincoln in 1863 and is not the same guy in 1865, at least on these fundamental issues of race in America. As I said, Lincoln, not a Martin Luther King Jr., he wasn't a total racial egalitarian, but he wasn't a visceral racist the way Andrew Johnson was. I think he had developed great compassion for the former slaves over the course of the Civil War, and also perfectly capable of dealing with Congress, which Andrew Johnson was. So I think what would have happened is out a Reconstruction plan. Be the 14th Amendment. In other words, equality before the law. They'll never give black people the right to vote. Don't worry about that. Well, that showed you how little he knew. So he stirred up a lot of opposition. What would the white South have done if faced with a united Congress and president saying, here is what you got to do for Reconstruction? Would they have accepted it and said, all right, that's what we got to do? Or would there have been still violent opposition? I don't know. It's impossible to say. And what would Lincoln have done if there was violent opposition? I don't know either. I mean, the problem with counterfactual history is you can kind of make a plausible case for a few months, but the further you go along with your scenario, the more it becomes just complete speculation. Reconstruction was a very difficult task, no matter who was the President of the United States. But I think it is plausible to imagine greater success in the long run than it actually achieved, and possibly if Lincoln had lived and was president through 1868, maybe greater success would have been accomplished. But, you know, of course, we don't know. Okay, I guess that's it. So thank you all very much, folks.
So, thank you again so much for coming. Eric will be in the lobby signing books or greeting you on your way out. Tomorrow, Jeff Rosen is speaking at noon at Stern. And then Greg Downs, who Eric mentioned, will be here on Saturday with a teacher workshop along with Ann Rubin, another one of the younger generation of historians who's working on Sherman's March in her case. So it's all a big, terrific series of events, and Eric has really kicked it off well for us, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no. We got so excited. I really thought he took it. We'll bring it to him.